The champagne glass slipped from my daughter-in-law's hand the instant her mother's knees buckled on my marble floor. A pale froth collecting at Helen's lips as the party noise scattered into sharp, frightened edges. I remember thinking, with a kind of chilly clarity that comes from long years in ruthless rooms, that outcome was never meant for her. I had built a consulting firm from nothing after my husband died 15 years earlier, sold it that afternoon for $23 million, and agreed, against my better instinct, to let my son Michael and his wife Jessica host a retirement celebration in my home. 2 hours before Helen collapsed, I watched Jessica glance around, draw a tiny vial from her purse, and empty it into the one champagne flute I always used at parties, the one with the small chip at the rim. I did not shout or perform a scene. I smiled, nodded through talk of market cycles, and waited until Jessica fussed over a tennis bracelet before placing that very glass near Helen's hand. 5 minutes later, Helen complimented the champagne's interesting flavor. 5 more, and paramedics were thundering through my doorway. At the hospital, I listened as staff whispered about plant alkaloids, while my son tried to keep me home and out of the way, his phone buzzing with messages he didn't want to answer, and Jessica pacing a groove into the linoleum. I knew then what I had suspected the moment I saw that vial. Someone wanted my sudden wealth to be newly unguarded by breath. Back in my quiet kitchen at dawn, I worked the kind of research you do with memory and motive instead of databases. Michael's architectural firm had struggled for years. Jessica's boutique sparkled more than it sold. Their house, cars, schooling, and habits far outpaced their income, while my gifts, a few thousand here, 10 there, had added up to nearly $200,000 in 5 years. All kindness without collateral. It was easy to see how generosity could be mistaken for an advance on an inheritance. Jessica's early morning call checking my symptoms told me she was searching for news the poison had found its rightful target. By mid-morning, my son arrived with pastries and a pitch dressed as concern. Active living communities with spas and golf courses, a place like Sunset Manor that just happened to require a sizable entrance fee paid quickly and a power of attorney on file. I heard the script under the tenderness, the nudge toward dependency, that would yield control. I spent that day buying a security system so tight a jewel box would envy it, and sat with my attorney to refortify the walls you cannot see. Medical directives with names carefully excluded. A will that redirected the bulk of my estate to research and charities. A trust that would support Michael in modest comfort, but never extravagance. And contingencies that would route everything to charity at the first whiff of manufactured incompetence. When Michael and Jessica returned that evening with polished concern, I let slip that I had updated my will. I watched panic and calculation chase each other across their faces. Later, on the security feed, I saw them argue in the car, until Jessica made a call she didn't want Michael to hear. The next morning brought an ally I had not expected. Helen, pale and steady, who remembered bitterness on her tongue and the small bottle in Jessica's hand, who admitted her daughter had been speaking for months about how unfair my money felt and how convenient natural causes could be. I told her the truth. I had switched the glasses. Then I called a private investigator from my old life and asked for everything about my son's finances, because if they wanted to play with my future, I would first see clearly into theirs. I chose the battlefield with care. Lunch with Michael at the restaurant where we had celebrated every milestone gave me a chance to sound timid about change, receptive to safety, ready to consider Sunset Manor. His relief was almost tender. I mentioned a deadline, an available unit that required money by Friday, and a facility policy that insisted a resident file a power of attorney. He agreed, of course, eager to help, convinced he was steering me while I guided the rudder he could not see. By Thursday morning, The investigator's report confirmed what debt always eventually reveals. The house leveraged to the rafters, a home equity line maxed, credit cards stacked like dominoes, the firm running at a loss for 2 years, payments to a geriatric psychiatrist named Richard Steinberg beginning months before anyone spoke to me about moving, and, like a stain that will not stop spreading, a $500,000 life insurance policy on me, with Jessica as beneficiary. I phoned my attorney. He had heard of Steinberg, a man whose assessments often echoed family wishes. The picture sharpened quickly, a push into a resort, a brisk signature granting control, and a cooperative evaluation declaring me unfit if I proved inconvenient. It would have worked had I not watched that vial tip over my chipped glass. That afternoon, Michael and Jessica spread papers across my dining table, contracts, financial disclosures listing every asset, and a power of attorney so broad a stranger could have run my life by dinner time. They called it standard. I called it a night to think. Then I called my attorney again and asked for something special for morning. Friday opened with a thin rain and the kind of gray light that makes people confess. I handed over signed admissions and a notarized power of attorney Michael accepted with shaking hands, convinced at last that the vault was about to open. I told them my attorney would stop by to finalize tax considerations. When the doorbell rang, 2 detectives stepped into my foyer beside the manila folder they carried like a verdict. The hospital toxicology had named oleander extract. The champagne bottle I had saved and sent for testing matched it. The glass with the highest concentration had originally been placed where I would have picked it up. The policy with Jessica's signature under beneficiary sealed motive in ink. I watched Michael's face change shape when he asked his wife what she had done, and listened to the silence that is not shock, but the sound of a plan learning it can bleed. They took Jessica away in cuffs. After the cruiser pulled from my drive, my son sat among fallen papers and whispered apologies about debt and fear, and a story he had told himself about protection, about moving me for my own good, about never knowing anything about poison. I asked for his phone, scrolled through messages that admitted a plan for tomorrow night to make sure I would beg for their help by Sunday, and handed it back without a word. He admitted he had consulted that friendly psychiatrist for months as a precaution, a phrase that sounded like the soft underside of cruelty. Then I told him the truth. The power of attorney he had cradled was a decoy that controlled exactly $1. The real assets were already beyond reach, the will now a quiet machine aligned to integrity, and every lever they had hoped to pull had been soldered shut. I felt only a sorrow worn smooth by understanding. Sometimes you cannot save someone from the person they have chosen to be. Time moved as if dragging its feet, and yet the consequences arrived with a punctuality I could set a watch by. Jessica pled and argued, and finally stood before a judge who measured intent and harm and the length of a life in years behind walls. She received 15 years for attempted murder. Michael faced conspiracy charges. His lawyer's best effort carved 3 years from a heavier number. I learned the ways grief travels through a house after the sirens have faded, how anger becomes a quiet visitor who sometimes sits in your favorite chair and watches you breathe. Then the phone rang, with a granddaughter's tears and hope braided together. Emma, 16 and startled awake by her parents' choices, asked to visit in the summer and told me she wanted to try a pre-law program at Northwestern. I told her yes, and that I was proud, because legacies are more than money and names. Helen became a fixture at my kitchen table, her careful hands around warm cups as we stitched together what had nearly been our last party. She talked of writing a book about elder abuse with our story as a caution. I told her to write it without flinching and to keep the ugly parts unvarnished. because truth is a disinfectant no polite fiction can match. My attorney came by with updates that proved institutions can sometimes do the right thing. The insurer voided Jessica's policy and refunded the premiums. Michael's creditors would take the Westfield house and everything they could liquidate. The trusts we had arranged were now fortified against bad actors and bad faith, set to pour into charity if anyone so much as whispered that I had forgotten my own name. I stood in a doorway and watched the roses my husband planted open across the fence line, as if nothing in the world had tried to poison them. In the evenings, I poured a glass of wine and learned the comfort of breathing without listening for footsteps. At first, safety was a list of devices and layers of alarms, and a panic pendant that could summon help in under 3 minutes. Eventually, safety became a posture I carried in my bones. I also learned the relief of numbers written out not as trophies, but as tools. The entrance fee they had pressed me toward, $400,000, would have been a clean bite out of liquidity. The modest support I reserved for Michael, $50,000 a year, would be enough to live without opulence, and only if he met the conditions carved into the trust. The $80,000 of revolving debt had been the tide that pulled them under. The $500,000 of insurance had been meant to float them back to shore on my breath. Instead, the money flowed where it could lift strangers' burdens. The neighborhood learned to smile at the new cameras and laugh politely at my joke about package thieves. I planted simple herbs in pots by the kitchen door and discovered I loved the smell of basil in the late afternoon. Grief softened into a kind of acceptance, not of what had been attempted, but of what had been revealed. The difference matters. When Emma arrived for the summer, the house felt like the home I had raised her father in, minus the shape his absence carved into hallways. She brought a backpack with dog-eared case books and an impatience for injustice that reminded me of myself at 20. We sat beneath the pergola where my husband once strung lights, and I told her the parts of the story I had not wanted her to learn from strangers. That greed rarely announces itself as greed, that it dresses in concern and uses words like safety, that sometimes the people you love will convince themselves they are rescuing you as they lead you toward a locked door. She asked if I could ever forgive her parents. I told her forgiveness is not a switch you flip. It is a long, stubborn practice that protects you more than the person you forgive, and even then it does not require you to unlock the door once you have secured it. We visited Helen together. Emma listened to the older woman's account of bitterness in the champagne and the memory of her daughter's hand twisting the tiny bottle cap, and I watched my granddaughter grasp that family is a word that can hold both shelter and storm. We spent a day in the city where I walked Emma past the building that had once housed my firm, telling her how to hire carefully, how to study the things people avoid saying, how to write memos with verbs that do not wobble. I told her what my husband taught me. You are not paranoid if someone is actually trying to hurt you, and even then you must meet danger with discipline rather than drama. At night I slept the kind of sleep I had not known since my business was young and hungry. Morning coffee at 6 a.m. tasted like permission. I read old journals and found the woman I had been at 40, at 50, at 60. Her voice steady through loss and risk and labor. The news cycle in labor. The news cycled in and out with the casual cruelty of headlines. Lawyers traded filings. The calendar page turned on the day Michael began his sentence. I did not attend any hearing that would have required me to walk the same hall as Jessica again. Some endings deserve privacy. I sent Emma the application deadlines for scholarships and wrote a note about how to read a contract out loud before signing, because your ear will catch what your eyes want to forgive. We made pies with the last of the summer peaches, When the crust broke in one corner, Emma laughed and called it rustic. I told her it tasted like freedom. A detective returned one afternoon to bring me a copy of the final report. Proof laid out in careful paragraphs that the poison in the bottle matched the poison in the blood, and the bottle had been opened by a woman whose mother would drink anything placed kindly at her elbow. I thanked the detective and marked the day not with celebration, but with a long walk past the gardens that ring my street. The neighbors waved. One asked after my security system. I told him it worked, but the better protection had been paperwork. He nodded without understanding because he had never sat in a lawyer's office while a lifetime of assets became lines that could not be crossed. My attorney visited with one more packet. Restructuring finalized, explicit instructions for charitable disbursements, and a trigger clause so elegant I smiled. A clause that whisked the entire estate to charity if any physician declared me incompetent without an independent review from a specialist of my choosing. It was a legal way of posting a sign. Do not mistake age for vacancy. In the quiet that followed, I thought about the strange mercy of limits. The trust that gave Michael a steady $50,000 a year came with conditions, demanding sobriety from entitled appetites, proof of employment, and counseling if lapses returned. People tut-tut at conditional love, written in legalese, but sometimes the kindest thing you can do is build a gate that only opens for growth. I will not say I did not cry. Grief is stubborn. It returns in odd shapes, a certain shade of blue in a tie on a morning show that reminds you of the one your son wore on his first day of high school. The smell of motor oil, because he once fixed a neighbor's mower. The way your own name sounds when spoken by a child who shares your eyes. When tears arrived, I let them. Then I stood up and watered the basil. Helen and I spoke about the book she wanted to write and made a pact not to sand down the edges. We practiced reading ugly sentences out loud so the words would lose some of their power. She told me she no longer woke at 3 a.m. tasting metal. I told her I no longer checked the front camera twice before bed. She laughed and said we were healing on schedule. Emma called one evening from the guest room to ask if I thought she could handle constitutional law. I told her she could handle anything she was willing to read 3 times. Later, she padded into the living room in socks to tell me she had been admitted to the pre-law summer program. The text pinged a minute later with a digital acceptance letter. We celebrated with ginger tea and a toast to work that restores. That night I wrote a single line in my journal. The opposite of being old is not being young. The opposite of being old is being underestimated. Autumn arrived with leaves the color of coins, which felt like a private joke the trees were telling on both of us. The insurance company recouped nothing from a policy that had been voided, but the gesture mattered. It was a public record that said greed is not a plan. My attorney delivered the last signatures that made the trust a fortress with windows big enough to let in light. We decided not to buy Michael and Jessica's house when the creditors invited an offer. Some beautiful things should belong to strangers who can afford them honestly. Every few weeks, Emma and I drove to a cafe where the espresso was too strong and the butter too generous. And we talked about cases, about the balance between compassion and precedent, about how the law can be used like a scalpel or a club, and how the ambition is to be a surgeon, never a brawler. She asked once, very softly, whether I missed the life I had before the party. I told her I missed some faces, and I missed a version of myself who believed certain promises were unbreakable. But I did not miss living without boundaries. I told her that love without boundaries becomes an inheritance for bullies. She wrote that down. Winter pressed its face to the windows, and I learned that peace is not silence. It is the freedom to choose what you let inside. I let in the laughter of a girl studying case law at the dining room table. The regular ping of Helen's texts about chapters and edits, the small satisfactions of paying every bill with money that had already done good beyond the amount printed on it. I let in the memory of my husband's voice telling me I had always been formidable. I left outside the stories my son told himself to make his decisions feel like duty. From time to time I opened a drawer and looked at photographs of a boy who once brought me dandelions. I did not throw them away, because love does not disappear just because trust did. In late winter, my attorney stopped by with one last note from the legal front. If anyone, anywhere, attempted to relitigate the guardianship angle with new evidence, the trust now included an automatic audit that would place subpoenas in the right hands before breakfast. He grinned in a way I had never seen before. "We have outlawyered the villains," his face said without words. I poured us both coffee, and we drank to the quiet triumph of systems well built. Spring found my garden wealthy with roses again, the new landscaping crew coaxing them into a discipline my husband would have admired. I sat beneath their blooming insistence and thought about how endings are misnamed. Most of the time, they are simply a more honest middle. I had begun this tale with a poisoned flute and a chipped rim and a woman who should never have tasted what she did. What matters now is not that I survived, though survival is no small miracle, but that I did more than survive. I learned exactly what it means to be powerful at 70. It means signing your name with precision, teaching a girl to read fine print with her ears, refusing to live in a house where your kindness is a line of credit someone else spends, and turning wealth into a verb that heals strangers. It means remembering that you can choose the terms on which you will be loved and the terms on which you will walk away. When the sun slid toward evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Emma. An acceptance to a summer program and a photo of her grin so large it could light a courthouse corridor. I wrote back that I was proud and that I would be in the front row of every important day she invited me to witness. The lesson I keep close is simple and costs nothing to share. The difference between being old and being powerless is paperwork, planning, and the courage to look love in the eye and ask it to behave. The last line I wrote in my journal that night was for anyone who might stumble across these pages one day. Do not underestimate a woman who has endured. She has already outlived your schemes. Thank you for staying with me through this. If this story moved you, please like to help it reach others. Share it with someone who might need the reminder. Subscribe for more true-to-life lessons wrapped in drama, and comment with your thoughts or experiences. I read every one.